Chapter 3, Sensation and Perception. In this chapter, we're going to look at what's going on with the 6 major senses: vision, hearing, touch, taste, pain, and smell. But before we do that, we need to understand what it means when we talk about sensation and what it means when we talk about perception. So the question is, how do we construct our representations of the external world? Well, what we do is we take in physical energy or sensory input in the form of a stimulus or stimuli from the environment, and our bodies convert it into neural signals that are interpreted in our brain. So this process of detecting physical energy, the input of sensory information, is called sensation. Next, what do we do with that sensory input? We have to make meaning of all of the signals that are coming our way. And the way we organize that sensory input and give meaning to it, this is called perception. So take a moment to look at this picture. When you first take a look at it, what do you see? Most of you are going to say, if you've never seen this picture before, that what you see is basically an amorphous blotch of black, white, and gray with very little meaning or organization. So, before you understand what this is a picture of, you are experiencing sensation. So you're receiving stimulation in an array of meaningless black, white, and gray sensory input. The image in this picture is of a Dalmatian dog bending over and drinking out of something like a stream. And it's in the very center of the picture. If you need help seeing that, sometimes it helps to squint or to blur your eyes and relax your field of vision a little bit. So now that you've organized this black, gray, and white sensory input into a picture of a dog, you have created meaning or a perception. The question is, why is this difficult to perceive? One of the reasons why, perhaps, is that this is not complete sensory input. The boundaries around the image are blurry, so it makes perception extremely difficult. So let's review. Again, sensation is the input of energy from an environmental stimulus. Perception is the organization of this stimuli into something meaningful. Now let's look at some principles of sensation. First of all, transduction. This is the process by which physical energy from the environment is converted into a neural signal that can be read by the brain. So let's look at a couple of basic concepts related to sensation. We're going to look at thresholds, and there are 3 different types of thresholds. We're going to look at absolute, subliminal, and the difference threshold. And we're also going to take a look at a concept called sensory adaptation. Let's do that now. The absolute threshold is the minimum or the least amount of stimulation necessary in order to detect a light, a sound, for example, pressure, taste, or odor, 50% of the time. So here's a way that you can directly experience absolute threshold for sound. Place a kitchen timer on a table in an otherwise quiet room. Move away so that you can no longer hear the ticking. Then gradually move toward the timer until you begin to hear the sound again. This is your threshold. However, if you stay there, you'll notice that occasionally you won't be able to hear the sound, and you'll need to step forward to reach that threshold again. At other times, the sound will get louder, and you will need to step back. This changing sensitivity indicates that absolute threshold is in fact anything but absolute. Our sensitivity does change from moment to moment and from measurement to measurement. Lapses of attention, sometimes fatigue, and other psychological changes can cause fluctuations in this absolute threshold. So the difference threshold, also called the just noticeable difference, is the smallest difference that can be detected between any two stimuli half the time. So basically, this is the detectable difference between two stimuli. A way to understand this is to dig into this concept presented by Weber, known as Weber's law. What Weber discovered is that two stimuli must differ by a constant proportion, not a constant amount, in order for their differences to be perceptible. So here's an example. Let's say you have 2 quarters. Place 2 quarters in one envelope. Next, get another quarter and place that in a second envelope. Close the envelopes and mix them up. Without looking, see if you can determine, by holding in your hands, which envelope has 2 quarters and which envelope has 1 quarter. Most likely, you can sense which envelope is heavier. That's the one with 2 quarters. Now, take off both your shoes. Mix the envelopes up, and then put one envelope in one shoe and one envelope in another shoe. Now, the differences are imperceptible because the proportion between the differences is not large enough for you to discern. The interesting thing about Weber's law is that you can apply this to the real world. Here's an example how it's used. Assume that a man wants to buy a 3-piece suit, and he also wants to buy a sweater. If you were a salesperson, which would you show him first in order to get him to spend the most money, because you do work on commission after all? You might think you should sell him the sweater first because, having spent a lot of money on a suit, the customer might be reluctant to spend more on the sweater. However, analysis of sales tells us to sell the suit first because the additional cost of the sweater will not so readily be noticed. So if the man just paid $500 for the suit, he's going to say, what's an additional $75 for the sweater? Not much compared to the suit, so he's more likely to buy it. So as a rule, people will almost always pay more for accessories if they buy them after rather than before a more expensive purchase. Have you ever noticed that when you've purchased a car, when you're all ready to sign the paperwork, that's when they push for that extra features such as the extended warranty or things like that? Or have you ever noticed that when you're checking out at Walmart, for example, all the things that are right next to that checkout station that you can just add on to your shopping cart because, hey, if you're already spending $200, what's another $5–10, right? But when you walk into the store, it was not in your mind to spend $5–10 on a bunch of little junky things at the checkout line. So keep that in mind. So remember, Weber's law says that two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage, right? Not a constant amount, in order to be perceived as different. So what we know is that light needs to differ by 8% in order for us to see that there's a difference. Weight needs to differ by 2%. Tone needs to differ by 3%. Let's talk about subliminal threshold. Subliminal threshold states that when stimuli are below someone's absolute threshold, we are not consciously aware of it. And that is our subliminal threshold. I'd like to read to you about James Vickery. And this story starts back in 1957. In 1957, market researcher James Vickery claimed that quickly flashing messages on a movie screen in Fort Lee, New Jersey, influenced people to buy more food and drinks. Vickery coined the term subliminal advertising. Vickery claimed that during the presentation of the movie Picnic, he used a tacky stethoscope to project the words "drink Coca-Cola" and "hungry, eat popcorn" for 1/3000th of a second at 5-second intervals during the film. Vickery claimed that during the test, the sales of popcorn and Coke in that New Jersey theater increased 57.8% and 18.1% respectively. However, in 1962, Vickery admitted to lying about this experiment and falsifying the results. The story itself was a marketing ploy. An attuned observer noticed that in Fort Lee, where the first experiment was alleged to have taken place, the small cinema couldn't possibly have had 45,699 visitors. So Vickery did confess in 1962 to making his study up. But before this confession, his claims were promoted in lots of books and other advertising campaigns, and this led to a public outcry. The practice of subliminal advertising was banned in the United Kingdom and in Australia and in the United States in 1958. So the moral of this story is stimuli that enter our consciousness below our threshold of awareness are not likely to induce us to act a certain way. Well, subliminal persuasion is not possible. We do understand that there is this concept of the mere exposure effect. And what this states is that repeated exposure to a stimulus increases a person's preference for it. And this is indeed the case and is supported by research. So what this means is that if you want to get your child to like Brussels sprouts, for example, the more times you present your child with Brussels sprouts at dinner, eventually they're more likely to acquire a taste for it. However, subliminal exposure to stimulus has a minor impact on our behavior only if we were going to do something in our repertoire that was related to that subliminal stimulus. So for example, if you're watching a film and you're really, really thirsty, and during that film there are subliminal messages about Mountain Dew, for example, and after the movie's over, you're really thirsty, you walk outside, you're more likely to choose a Mountain Dew over a Coca-Cola, but it does not cause you to do anything that wasn't already in your repertoire. At this point, I'm going to pause the first part of the sensation and perception video to give you time to review your notes, and we'll start talking about vision next.